Why hello there, and welcome to the Stories for My Lights YouTube channel, where you can find the most mediocre stories ever made under one roof. Now first, I would like to start wishing all of you a happy holiday season, whichever holidays you celebrate. As you'll notice, I have a Christmas tree behind me. I thought this would be a great backdrop for part 4 of Craig and the Magic Deck. If you haven't seen parts 1, 2, and 3, please look in the description below or wherever the description is in whichever piece of software you're using to browse YouTube. Now, if you'll recall, in the last episode, Craig had spiraled down a tunnel, discovered a strange metal chamber, used his cards to get inside, and discovered feather light but steel strong armor, and a sword that he could wield which he knew had great power. He had fallen asleep underneath one of these giant machines, knowing that in the morning, something would happen. He woke up. Now, he wasn't sure if it was morning or not, but what he did know is he felt well rested and in higher spirits. For after a good night's sleep, one generally has a better disposition towards the world. He awoke. He listened, popped his head out. There were no sounds, no footfalls of these strange lizard creatures, no sounds of the giant machines turning and churning the earth in their giant drill bits. So he slowly crept out from underneath the giant machine. He listened again, nothing. And so he started making his way back up the giant passage which he had come down. And when he finally arrived at the top and emerged into the giant chamber with the other machines in the lava, he was surprised to see that 3 of the large machines were once again gone. 4 of them remained sitting there unused. He strained and he listened as best he could, but he could hear nothing. He cupped his hands to his ears, and he could almost hear in the distance the sound of rocks being churned, but it sounded very far away. He looked, and he could see nothing, so he ran as fast as he could to one of the other machines, jumped under it and hid, and once again looked and listened, for he knew he could take no chances with these lizard creatures. There was nothing. He reasoned that given that this giant chamber had tunnels going off in every which way, he had to go down one of the tunnels to find out what these creatures were doing and why. And he knew deep within his heart, in his soul, in his gut, in his very being, he had to stop them. He looked at the tunnel nearest to him, cupped his ears and listened. He couldn't hear the sounds of drilling coming from it. So he emerged from under the machine, sprinted as fast as he could until he reached the entrance of the giant tunnel and walked inside. This tunnel was identical to the other tunnel. It had smooth walls. You could tell it had been drilled with the same startling machinery. This one didn't have candles in it. He wondered if that meant that this was abandoned. He walked down as far as he could until the darkness grew so black that he couldn't see. And he wondered, what was he to do? The batteries from his flashlight were dead, and he had no torch. He couldn't imagine taking the time to run all the way back to that other tunnel and grabbing a torch, nor could he imagine or tolerate the danger of doing such. He sat down for a moment and set his sword next to him. Then he noticed something. He could see a blue glow coming out from his sheath. He could see a blue glow coming out from the sheath of his sword. He unsheathed the blade and noticed that it was glowing a bright, hot blue, like the kind of flame you see at the hottest fire. He held it in front of him, and it was just bright enough to illuminate the cave. He put his sheath back onto his belt and held the sword out in front of him, walking forward very closely and carefully, for his eyes had not adjusted. Fortunately for him, there weren't many obstacles in the cave. There was nothing. No stalactites, no stalagmites, no ravines, no rivers, just the giant tunnel that this machine had drilled. What he did notice is there seemed to be more dust covering the floor below him, for it was very easy to see his footprints when he looked back behind himself. He wondered why. It seemed as if the creatures had abandoned this tunnel. But why would they drill it and then abandon it? The work, the time, the sheer energy and effort involved to power a machine to drill this tunnel, this wasn't something people did lackadaisically. Well, he wouldn't have an answer until he got to the bottom. He walked once more for what seemed like hours. At the halfway mark, he stopped, fished a protein bar out of his bag, and ate by the blue glow of his sword. Once again, he rose and proceeded down and down and down. His legs were getting tired. He was a little frightened that whatever was lighting his sword up would run out, but he did know that if he just put his hand along the wall, eventually he would find his way back to the top. So he walked. He could not tell if he walked for 10 minutes or 10 hours, because in his little bubble of blue surrounded by the darkness, time seemed to lose all meaning. It was him, the sword, the dark, and the sound of his feet falling and flapping. It was a wonderful thing, though, he hadn't gotten so weary he wasn't paying attention. Because as he was walking, he noticed there in front of him was a chasm. He had his foot over it, almost stumbled forward and fell into it. But fortunately, he didn't, and he rocked back on his heels and went, "Whoa!" He took out his sword and held it over the chasm. He couldn't see the other side. He couldn't see the bottom. All he could see were jagged edges descending down into an abyss of darkness. Who knew how far down this chasm went, this ravine, these strange underground depths? "Hello?" he called out, and all he could hear was hello, 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 echoing off the walls for what seemed like an eternity. He didn't hear any of the creatures. He didn't hear any of the machines. This area truly was abandoned. He sat down and he dangled his feet over the edge and he just listened. He wondered if perhaps he would hear the sound of water, of stones falling, of the machines, of the creatures, anything. But there was nothing. At least so he thought. After some time in the darkness, he did hear something. It was the sound of wind, gently moving through the chasm. Now he wondered to himself, how could there possibly be wind down here? Surely we're a mile underground, perhaps more. There shouldn't be wind or a draft. What is this? He sat and he listened, and the wind seemed to ebb and flow, as it would outside. But it didn't much change. In fact, it was oddly consistent. He could feel, in his heart, he had to go down this chasm, but he didn't know how. He didn't have a rope. Then, of course, he realized that he does, in fact, have a magical deck of cards. So he pulled out the magical deck, opened it up, and looked inside, and he thumbed through the cards. None of them seemed useful, until finally, he found one that merely had a picture of a feather on it. He had assumed this was a card to use to tickle somebody or cause a distraction, or perhaps even to fly. But now he wondered, could it make you light as a feather? Well, he reasoned it was his only chance. Now, Craig knew that it was far too dangerous to use the card and then simply jump off the edge. So what he did is he tapped the card on himself, and he noticed it started glowing yellow, but it didn't disappear. He tapped it 2 more times, and then it turned orange and then purple and then faded away into dust. And then he jumped as high as he could in the air, and he noticed that he did indeed fall gently back to the ground. He knew that if he thought about it too much, he would lose his courage. So he walked to the edge of the chasm and took a step over the edge. He expected to feel the queasy sensation of a rapid descension in his stomach, but he didn't. He floated gracefully until he reached the bottom of the deep, dark chasm. He must have floated for 20-25 minutes. He knew this chasm were deep. He also knew that unless he had a card that let him fly, he was not going to get back up the same way he had came down. That should have filled him with fear, but he had magical armor, a backpack filled with candy bars and protein bars, and a sword and a magical deck. He figured he would figure something out. So he stopped and he listened. He could still hear the sound of the breeze, but this time it was somewhat louder. He held still, and he felt the direction that the breeze was blowing from. He didn't know if he should walk to the edge where the breeze was going or to the entrance, because in order for there to be a draft like that, there had to be some sort of opening and some sort of exit. He decided that he would go towards where the wind was blowing, because he just knew these creatures, these green creatures, were searching for something in this deep, dark earth. Maybe they were searching for the weapons he had already found, or maybe they were searching for something different. He didn't know. He didn't necessarily want to know, but he knew he had to know. And so he walked. And once again, through the darkness, he ambled and shambled. Now he was much more careful down here because there were rocks jutting up and protruding from the ground. There were every so often stalagmites standing proud from the ground. Though he were creeping slower than before, he found himself enthusiastic and untiring, and so he walked. This cavern was massive. He had no idea how long he would have to travel. He did think it was neat that this most likely was a cavern that nobody had ever explored before. He might have been the only human, perhaps the only living creature ever to set foot in these depths. So he walked, and he walked, and he walked until he grew tired. Finally then, he laid his backpack up against a stone, laid his head down on it, and slept. As he was sleeping, he got startled awake by the sound of rock smacking down from high above onto the ground near him. At first he thought it must have been a dream, because certainly there was nothing down here and nobody down here. But once again, another stone fell from up above and landed near him. He put his sword in his sheath to make the light go away and crawled up against the nearest stone as he could to make himself as small as possible and as camouflaged as possible in the darkness. He breathed as quietly as he could. He did his best not to move. He heard more stones falling. He didn't know what was happening. But after a time, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. He saw a faint orange glow of light illuminating from the rock face far above. He looked at it. It seemed to be moving. Down, down, down. It was moving downward in a slow, herky-jerky movement that reminded him of a mountain climber. Who could be climbing down here, and why? He watched and he waited until eventually the warm orange light was on the ground level, same as him. And he could see now that it was a torch flickering and dancing in the darkness. It looked exactly like one of the magic torches of that green creature. It seemed to be walking towards him, for things were getting brighter, until eventually the fire danced off the walls near him, casting an eerie glow. His heart sank, because as the light got closer, he could see two of the green creatures walking around. "He's down here. We know it." "How do you know it?" the other one asked. "She felt him. She sensed him. We must get him before he discovers us." "What is he going to discover? He's just a boy." "Yes, well, she says he's special, and so we will do what she says. Do you want to face the consequence of crossing her?" "No, I don't," the creature said. They turned around and they walked away from him in the direction that he was going. He decided he might as well follow them. So he waited until they got far enough ahead where there was no way they could see him, and he crept after them. Every time the orange glow would move forward, he would move forward. Now he moved forward as cautiously as he could and as carefully as he could, running from stone to stone, hiding behind stalagmites or even outcroppings of the canyon walls. He wasn't careful enough, because as he got up to follow the light once more, he kicked a large stone, and the sound of stone on stone scraped and echoed and seemed to reverberate through the entire canyon in an impossibly loud way. The light in front of him stopped and then started heading back towards him, but this time it started heading back faster. He realized something. He would not be able to outrun these creatures. They were inhumanly fast. So he found a small outcrop of rock on the canyon side and wedged himself up against it to make himself look as small and blend in as much as he could. But it was no good. The other creature had pulled out another torch, and one of them had seemed to get some sort of flashlight. It was bright enough where they would easily see him. And they did, when the light shined on him.
"There he is, get him! Yes, she will want us to get him."
He emerged and he drew his sword. They seemed to shy backwards when they saw the blue glow.
"He's got it, he's got one! Yes, the ancient blades. We must run! Do you know what she will do to us if we run? Attack!"
And so they drew forth blades of their own. Now, the blades they had were not made of steel. They seemed impossibly thin and impossibly strong and impossibly light, but they didn't glow with magic. Now, you might be asking yourself, what could Craig possibly do with a sword, even a magic sword? He had never fought with a sword before. He had never so much as swung a sword before this moment. But as he held the blade, he found in his mind there were images of swordsmen darting, lunging, parrying, swinging, riposteing, if that's how you say that. All of the moves a great swordsman would know, and he was surprised. While the armor wasn't controlling his body, it seemed to guide him. He raised his blade to reflect one of their blades, did a twist, slashed downwards, and hit the creature on its leg muscle. It rolled around on the ground, writhing and shrieking in pain. The other creature looked at him and came at him with a massive overhand swing, swung as hard as it could. He raised his blade, and then as the blades clanged together, he spun around in a circle, cutting the creature's leg. They both fell to the ground.
No, don't hurt us. Yes, let us go. We will leave you alone, we promise.
Craig couldn't find it in his heart to hurt the creatures. He pointed the opposite way down the canyon and told them to go. They got up on one leg and hopped and hobbled and shambled away as quick as they could. Craig knew he was going to regret letting them go, but he knew he had to. He wasn't a killer. He didn't want to hurt these creatures. It sounded as if they were being forced to do things against their will as well. So he grabbed one of their torches, sheathed his blade, and started running in the direction he was going as fast and as quickly as he could. It didn't take him too long before he got what he found. For once more, ahead of him loomed a giant building made of stone, or rather than made of stone, carved from the earth itself. This was a castle the likes of which Craig had never seen or imagined, for the canyon opened up into a large cavern, so big it felt as if he was outside. And the walls of this castle spread out in every direction as far as he could see. Inside the castle, there were no lights. There were no sounds. Nobody had lived here. Perhaps nobody had lived here or tread foot here for thousands of years. Craig didn't know, but once again, he could feel that pull in his stomach, urging him forward. He walked for some time until he found a giant castle door set ajar. The doors themselves were the size of houses. They looked old. He could see wear and tear, mold and moss on the beams of wood. They seemed in good shape. He walked inside, ready for whatever adventure would bring to him next. And that is the end of part 4 of Craig and the Magic Deck. Join me next time to find out what happens inside this castle. What are the goblins trying to hide? Had they even known this existed? Well, we all know something important is there, but we're not going to find out what until the next episode. Thanks for joining me, anyone and everyone. You could subscribe and give me a thumbs up if you like these. Otherwise, you could just tell me how handsome I am down in the comments. That would also be okay. To my boy Alden, I want you to know that I love you very, very much. And every time I tell you one of these stories, it's because I am filled with love and joy that you are my son and in my life. Good night to you, Alden, and good night to anyone else who might find themselves perusing the madness of my mind. Good evening.